Usually, when we talk about human behavior, or like specifically when we try to pin down the exact mechanics of making a choice, there's this underlying assumption of total precision.
Right. It feels almost like engineering, you know?
Exactly. You're sitting at a diner, you look at a menu, and you point your finger at the cheeseburger instead of the house salad, and the waiter writes it down.
It feels incredibly straightforward. Just clean.
Yeah, you walk away with this deeply ingrained, unquestioned belief that you were the absolute, uncaused author of that specific choice.
It is deeply comforting to look at human action that way, isn't it? We naturally want the internal workings of our minds to be visible and, well, easily categorized.
We do. We desperately want to believe there's a little sovereign king sitting on a throne somewhere inside our prefrontal cortex.
Yeah, completely insulated from the rest of reality, just handing down edicts and making decisions entirely independent of the universe around us.
But then you step into the world of 18th century philosophy, specifically looking at the raw mechanics of human volition, and suddenly that clean, binary way of looking at the world just shatters.
It really does. The landscape of human choice isn't clean at all. It's incredibly murky.
It's full of trapdoors. So today, we are embarking on a mind-bending exploration of that exact moment of choice.
Which is going to be a wild ride.
It is. We're looking at a text that is dense, highly influential, and honestly, frankly, intimidating. It's a treatise by the American philosopher and theologian Jonathan Edwards called The Freedom of the Will.
And to be clear, we aren't just skimming the introductory surface of this book today.
No, definitely not. We are focusing entirely on the explosive surgical arguments found in Part 2 of the text.
And surgical is really the perfect word for what Edwards is doing in Part 2. The entire mission of this deep dive is to test the ultimate logical limits of human free will.
Right. Edwards is taking a scalpel to a very specific and heavily defended notion of liberty.
It's what he refers to as the Arminian notion of liberty.
So, to understand what Edwards is actually trying to dismantle, we have to establish what that term means in the context of the 18th century, because the text name drops a lot of groups and thinkers.
Oh, absolutely. Arminians, Calvinists, Pelagians.
Writers like Dr. Whitby, Dr. Clark, and Mr. Chubb. It can sound like a foreign language if you don't know the landscape.
It really can. So let's lay that groundwork. During Edwards' time, and, well, for centuries prior, there was this massive intellectual war being fought over the nature of human agency and divine sovereignty.
Like a massive theological turf war.
Exactly. On one end of the spectrum, you had Calvinists who generally emphasized the absolute sovereignty of God and the idea that human choices are bound by their fallen nature and divine decree.
And Edwards himself was defending a compatibilist view that aligned with Calvinist theology.
Right, he was, yeah. Though it's worth noting that in Part 2, his arguments are almost entirely based on pure logic rather than scripture.
Which is what makes it so universally fascinating.
Right. Then on the other end, you had Pelagians, which is an older school of thought, arguing that humans have absolute uncorrupted free will.
Okay, so where did the Arminians fit in?
They're somewhere in the middle, but heavily leaning toward autonomous free will.
And they are Edwards' primary target in this text.
Yes. When Edwards talks about Arminian liberty, he's summarizing a specific philosophical framework defended by thinkers of his era, like Thomas Chubb and Daniel Whitby.
And he distills their view of free will down to 3 foundational pillars, which, to be fair, is how most people walking down the street today naturally think about their own freedom.
Absolutely. So let's walk through those 3 pillars.
Okay, first, there is the idea of a self-determining power of the will. The claim here is that the will has absolute sovereignty over itself.
Right. So it isn't pushed or pulled by anything outside of its own inherent power. It just causes its own actions.
Right. The second pillar is the concept of a state of perfect indifference. This argues that for a choice to be genuinely free, your mind has to be in a state of perfect equilibrium right up until the moment of decision.
Meaning you can't have any prior bias, inclination, or motive dragging you one way or the other. You just have to be hovering in a state of total neutrality.
Like a perfectly balanced set of vintage scales, neither side tipping even a fraction of a millimeter.
That's a great image for it.
Yeah.
And the third pillar is pure contingence. This is the argument that free actions happen without any absolute necessity.
So they are not the inevitable result of a prior chain of causes and effects.
Exactly. Under this view, a choice just comes into existence contingently without being inextricably linked to anything that happened before it.
Okay, so before we get into tearing these down or watching Edwards tear them down, let's set some crucial ground rules for our exploration today.
Good idea.
Because this text dives into theological crossfires between these historical figures, it is very easy to get bogged down in picking teams. We are taking absolutely no sides today.
None at all. We are strictly neutral observers here.
Our mission is just to decode the rigorous logical maze that Jonathan Edwards constructs in Part 2.
Because he is attempting to prove, using the unyielding laws of cause and effect, that this specific three-pillared version of free will is actually a mathematical and logical impossibility.
He isn't merely stating a difference of opinion. He's attempting to demonstrate that the Arminian definition of free will contradicts its own existence.
And for you, the listener, I mean, this is deeply personal. Every time you make a decision today, what to eat, what to say, whether to keep listening to this deep dive or turn it off, you operate on the assumption that you have that self-determining power.
You feel like you are acting from a state of indifference and contingence.
Edwards is going to take a magnifying glass to the microsecond you make that choice and force you to ask what actually just occurred.
So let's start by analyzing that first pillar, the self-determining power of the will. Edwards approaches this claim by asking a deceptively simple question.
Right. He basically says, if the will determines its own free acts, what is the actual mechanism by which it does that?
Here's where it gets really interesting, because Edwards' logic here is like a trap slowly closing. He says, okay, let's grant the premise. The will determines its own actions. But how does a will determine anything?
Well, the only way a will can act or exert influence or determine an outcome is by an act of willing, by an act of choice.
Which means if the will determines its own free act, it must do so by a preceding act of choice.
Wait, slow down. Let me try to visualize this because the phrasing gets slippery.
It does, yeah.
Let's say I make a free choice. I decide to buy a red car instead of a blue one. We'll call that ultimate decision choice A.
Okay, choice A.
According to the Arminian theory of self-determination, my will had to be the sovereign cause of choice A. But you're saying Edwards argues that to cause choice A, my will had to make a prior choice to cause it.
Yes, think about the definition of determining something. To determine a specific outcome requires a preference for that outcome. You have to lean toward it and actively exert power to make it happen.
Right, okay.
That exertion of power, that leaning, is itself an act of volition. It is a choice. So to determine choice A, your will had to execute a prior volition. Let's call it choice B.
But if choice B is also a free act of the will, then the will must have determined choice B as well.
Exactly. Which means it required choice C to determine choice B, which determined choice A.
And now you see the trap. You are falling backward into an infinite regress.
It's like setting up an endless line of dominoes. If every falling domino is pushed by the one behind it, what pushed the very first domino in the sequence?
Edwards is tracing the chain of choices back to the absolute origin point. And he brings us to a devastating dilemma regarding that very first choice in the chain.
Let's look closely at that hypothetical first domino of volition.
Right. If that first choice is not determined by the will, then by the Arminians' own definition, it isn't a free choice.
Because it was caused by something else.
Yes. And if the foundation of the entire chain isn't free, then none of the subsequent choices determined by it can be truly free either. It's just a chain reaction initiated by something outside the will's sovereign control.
I see the problem, but what if the Arminian argues that the first choice is determined by the will?
Well, if the first choice is determined by the will, then, by the logic we just established, there must be an act of choice before the first choice to determine it.
Which is a blatant logical contradiction.
You cannot have a choice prior to the first choice. It is a mathematical absurdity. Edwards compares it to a train of 10,000 links. If you say the motion of the whole chain is determined by the first link, but the first link is moved by something outside the chain.
Then the chain is not moving itself.
Exactly.
So the very concept of the will determining itself requires an infinite loop of choices going backward into eternity, with no starting point.
Now, looking at the historical context, the writers Edwards was arguing against were not foolish. They saw this infinite regress problem looming, and the text shows they tried to construct workarounds.
They did. Edwards specifically targets an anonymous author who wrote an essay on the freedom of the will and God in the creature.
And this author tried to argue that maybe one act of the will doesn't determine another act. Maybe it's the faculty of the will itself or the soul that determines the volition without any prior act.
So they are attempting to separate the doer from the doing to break the infinite chain.
Right. They want to argue that the soul doesn't have to perform an act to determine a choice. The soul just inherently possesses a power that radiates the determination.
But Edwards doesn't let them off the hook, does he?
Not at all. He points out that for the soul to direct, decide, or determine a specific outcome, that process is, by definition, an action.
Right. You cannot exert an influence to produce a specific effect in reality without a prior exertion. If the soul exercises power to dictate a choice, that exercise of power is an act of the will.
It's just a semantic evasion. To say the soul determined it, not a prior choice, is just giving a new name to the same mechanism.
Because if the soul is actively directing an outcome, it is choosing. And if it is choosing,
We are right back in the infinite regress.
this inevitably forces the defenders of self-determination into an even more radical corner. If the choice isn't determined by a prior choice, and it isn't determined by some mysterious, non-acting action of the soul, well, what if it just happens?
What if a choice simply comes to pass without any cause at all?
Yeah, the ultimate random number generator firing off in the brain.
Edwards treats this idea with utter philosophical disdain. He asserts that it is a fundamental dictate of human reason and common sense that nothing begins to be without a cause.
And he takes this to a cosmological level. He says it is as absurd to claim that a human volition can pop into existence without a cause as it is to say the globe of the Earth or the entire universe itself can just materialize out of the void without a creator or a cause.
Those are massive comparisons. He's elevating a single thought in your head to the exact same physical and metaphysical laws that govern planets.
He's arguing that if you allow even a single thought or choice to materialize from absolute nothingness, without any prior reason, motive, or ground for its existence, you have broken the foundational laws of reality.
Because think about the implications for freedom. If a choice truly has no cause whatsoever, then the will isn't the cause of it.
And if the will isn't the cause of it, then the will certainly didn't determine it.
And if the will didn't determine it, then you are not the author of that choice.
That is honestly a little terrifying to think about. If a choice is totally uncaused, it's just a random accident that happened to you.
It's an internal lightning strike.
Yeah, you can't claim ownership over a random accident, and you certainly can't call a random neurological misfire freedom.
But the Arminian writers, like Thomas Chubb, attempt another defense here. They argue that we cannot compare the human soul to inanimate objects like planets or falling dominoes.
Because spirits and souls possess an active nature.
Right. Because humans are active beings by design, they argue we can be the spring of our own action without requiring an external cause to push us.
Okay, I mean, I can see the intuitive appeal of that. An asteroid needs gravity to move, but I am a living, breathing entity. I have internal energy.
And Edwards acknowledges that.
Yeah.
He agrees the soul has an active nature. But he makes a critical distinction. Merely possessing a general activity of nature does not explain why the soul chooses this specific action over that specific action at this specific moment in time.
Let's unpack that.
Think of your active nature as the engine of a car. The engine provides the raw power and the capacity for motion. It is an active thing.
Sure.
But a running engine alone does not decide whether the car turns left at the intersection or right. To explain the specific direction, you need a steering wheel, a driver, a destination, a motive.
If someone asks, why did the car turn left? And you answer, because it has an engine, you haven't answered the question at all.
You've only explained how it was able to move, not why it moved in that particular direction.
Exactly. Edwards argues that activity of nature will no more enable a being to produce specific, directed effects without a cause than if it had no active nature at all.
An active nature explains the capacity for volition, but it does not provide the cause for a specific, distinct choice.
So relying on active nature is, in Edwards' view, an impertinent answer. It completely dodges the question of what caused the specific determination.
So by dismantling the mechanics of the will willing itself, Edwards leaves the first pillar in ruins.
Self-determination either requires an infinite, mathematically impossible loop of prior choices, or it relies on random, uncaused accidents, which destroys the very concept of agency. It's incredibly tight logic.
It really is.
But let's shift to the second pillar, because this is where Edwards' psychological observation is just staggering. Let's talk about the illusion of indifference, or the requirement of perfect equilibrium.
This is a crucial battleground in part 2. What's fascinating here is how the Arminian argument hinges on this idea that for a choice to be genuinely free, the mind cannot be biased before the choice is made.
Right, it must be in a state of perfect indifference.
Yeah, if the mind is already leaning heavily toward one option because of a strong desire or motive, then the choice is being dictated by that bias, not by the sovereign power of the will. To be free, You must sit perfectly on the fence until the exact nanosecond you decide to jump.
But Edwards looks at this requirement and points out a glaring, almost comical paradox in the very definition of the words. He notes that to choose something while remaining in a state of perfect indifference means that you have a preference at the exact same moment you have no preference.
It is a literal oxymoron. Edwards argues that the act of choosing is fundamentally the act of preferring.
If you are truly indifferent, you are not choosing.
The moment you exert a choice, you are demonstrating a preference, which means you are no longer indifferent. Therefore, a choice can never be executed in a state of indifference. You cannot choose without a choice.
I have to play the skeptic here because the authors Edwards is critiquing bring up a very famous counterargument. There's an old philosophical thought experiment, usually traced back to the 14th century, and a thinker named Jean Buridan, known as Buridan's ass.
Oh yes, the donkey.
The paradox imagines a donkey placed exactly halfway between two identical bales of hay. Because the donkey is perfectly rational and the bales are identical, it has no motive to prefer one over the other. It is in a state of perfect indifference.
And the paradox suggests the donkey would stand there and starve to death because it lacks a determining motive to move left or right.
Right. And the Arminian writers use variations of this to prove human freedom. They say, unlike the donkey, a human would choose.
Right. The text mentions scenarios like being told to touch a random square on a chessboard, or being offered two completely identical eggs, or two identical cakes.
Yeah, if you hold out two identical eggs to me and say, pick one, I genuinely do not care which one I get. In my mind, egg A and egg B are of perfectly equal value. I am in a state of profound indifference.
Yet you don't starve to death.
No, I reach out and grab one. Doesn't that physical action categorically prove that my mind can formulate a choice and execute an action while remaining in a state of perfect indifference?
It is a brilliant objection, and it feels completely intuitive to our everyday experience. But Edwards provides a solution that practically anticipates modern cognitive psychology.
Oh, how so?
He says the confusion lies in failing to distinguish between the objects of the choice and the action of the choice.
Okay, walk me through that distinction.
When you are staring at those two identical eggs, your mind is indeed in a state of indifference regarding the objects themselves. You do not prefer the physical matter of egg A over the physical matter of egg B. They are equal in your estimation.
Right.
However, your mind is not making a choice between two floating objects in a vacuum. Your mind is choosing the action of taking one of them.
And what drives the choice of the action, if not a preference for the egg?
An overarching motive.
Sure.
You are not standing there without context. Perhaps you are hungry and want to eat an egg. Perhaps a friend offered it to you and societal norms dictate you accept it.
I have a very strong motive to perform the action of taking an egg.
Since taking both is a violation of the offer, and standing there indefinitely is absurd and disagreeable, your mind determines that the most agreeable course of action is to simply pick one and resolve the situation.
I understand having a motive to act in general, but the mystery remains. How does my mind pick which specific action to take, reaching left versus reaching right, if I am completely indifferent to the eggs themselves?
Edwards argues that the mind chooses the specific action based on momentary, perhaps almost imperceptible circumstances. A fleeting fixation of the eye, a slight physical posture leaning one way, or an arbitrary thought resting on one side.
Wow.
At that exact microscopic fraction of a second, the action of taking the egg that your eye happens to be resting on appears to your mind as the most direct, agreeable way to fulfill your overarching motives.
So my internal monologue isn't saying I choose egg A because egg A possesses superior qualities.
No. Your mind is concluding, the action of reaching for the egg currently in my line of sight is the most efficient way to satisfy my desire to eat and move on with my day.
The choice of the action is entirely driven by the motive to comply with the situation, guided by a momentary physical or mental circumstance.
It is never driven by pure indifference. Edwards writes that the mind's determination is not about the objects, except indirectly. It is about the actions. And the mind is never indifferent about its own actions in the exact moment it performs them. It always prefers the action it executes.
That completely neutralizes the chessboard and identical cakes argument. It's not about the cake, it's about the desire to eat cake.
Exactly.
But the defenders of this liberty have one more evasion regarding indifference. They argue, okay, perhaps the final choice isn't made in a state of indifference, but the core of our freedom is the power to suspend the choice, to hit pause, step back into a state of indifference, deliberate on the options, and then proceed.
The suspension evasion. It's a very common defense. But Edwards shuts this down using the exact same unyielding logic we saw in the first pillar. Suspending a choice, or making the cognitive decision to hit pause and deliberate, is itself an act of the will.
I have to actively choose to suspend my judgment.
Precisely. So we must interrogate that specific act of suspension. Does the act of suspending spring from a state of perfect indifference? Think about it. If you are perfectly indifferent to the outcome, why would you expend the mental energy to choose to suspend and deliberate?
Well, I wouldn't. I would only hit pause if I had a reason to, like a fear of making a mistake or a desire to gather more information to ensure I get the best outcome.
Exactly. You must have a motive that makes the act of suspending appear more agreeable to your mind than acting immediately. Therefore, the act of suspension is entirely driven by a motive, not by indifference.
If the Arminian insists that the suspension is driven by pure indifference, they are plunged right back into the absurdity of an uncaused event.
A perfectly balanced scale does not tip itself to buy time. Edwards proves that a state of pure indifference is a state of total paralysis.
So, if the will cannot determine itself without an infinite regress, and it cannot act in a state of indifference without a motive, well, we arrive at the third pillar, which Edwards tackles in section 3 of his arguments.
This is the battle over motives, necessity, and what he calls the dictates of the understanding.
And this is where Edwards turns the weapons of his opponents directly against them. The Arminian requirement of contingence demands that a free act cannot be the necessary consequence of a motive.
Right. If a strong motive guarantees a specific choice, like if you are starving and someone offers you a banquet and your hunger necessitates that you eat, they argue you are not acting freely. For true contingence, the choice must be able to go either way, regardless of how powerful the motives are.
To dismantle this, Edwards extensively quotes the very writers who champion this view, particularly Dr. Whitby and Dr. Clark, and he uncovers a massive, fatal admission in their own writings.
He points out that even these staunch defenders of contingence, when pressed on how the mind actually functions, concede that the will always follows what they term the last dictate of the understanding.
Okay, let's unpack this. We need to define that phrase carefully. The understanding in this context is the mind's faculty of perception and judgment. It is how you evaluate the world.
And the last dictate refers to whatever the mind perceives in the exact final microsecond before an action as the greatest good or the most agreeable option available.
So if my understanding evaluates my finances and my desire for transportation, its last dictate might be that buying a reliable used car is the most agreeable path.
Yes. And Whitby and Clark admit that the will must invariably follow that final assessment. The will cannot look at the mind's evaluation of the greatest good and decide to choose what the mind simultaneously perceives as a lesser good. The will aligns perfectly with the understanding's final verdict.
But wait, hold on. If Whitby and Clark admit that the will always and infallibly follows the mind's view of the greatest good, aren't they just handing Edwards the victory?
They are. And they don't seem to realize it until Edwards points it out. He highlights this massive philosophical inconsistency. If the will must infallibly follow the mind's view of the greatest good, then the will's choices are completely inextricably necessary.
They are determined by something outside the will itself, namely, the understanding and the motives presented to it.
It destroys the idea of the will as a sovereign king. If the will is entirely bound to execute the final judgment of the understanding, then the will is just a subservient executive branch carrying out the orders of the cognitive branch. It has no independent power to veto the mind's perception of what is most agreeable.
Edwards writes that if this is true, and his opponents concede that it is, then every act of choice depends on and is necessarily connected with some antecedent cause or motive.
The choice could not have been otherwise, given the exact state of the understanding in that moment. Therefore, Arminian contingence is entirely dead in the water.
Edwards' dissection of these writers gets even sharper when he analyzes the work of Mr. Thomas Chubb. When Edwards lays out Chubb's arguments sequentially, the logic is so contradictory it's almost comical.
Chubb is a fascinating case study because he attempts to embrace two completely irreconcilable concepts simultaneously to save free will.
First, Chubb explicitly agrees that a motive is absolutely necessary for any action to occur. Edwards quotes him saying, "No action can take place without some motive to excite it."
But in the very same breath, desperate to maintain the will's absolute sovereignty, Chubb claims that a person chooses whether to yield to a motive or not. And he even asserts that a person can deliberately choose to follow a weaker motive over a stronger one.
Think about the chronological nightmare this creates. Let's trace Chubb's logic on a timeline. Chubb establishes that a motive must exist to induce an action. So motive X presents itself to the mind. According to Chubb, the mind must then choose whether to comply with motive X.
I'm trying to visualize the timeline in the air here. If the mind chooses to comply with the motive, before the motive actually exerts its influence to cause the action, well, then the choice comes before the cause of the choice.
That is the exact paradox Edwards exposes. The motive is supposed to be the cause that excites the choice. But Chubb is arguing that the will chooses to allow the motive to be the cause, which means there must be a choice prior to the influence of the motive.
But Chubb already conceded that no action, including the act of choosing to comply, can take place without a prior motive.
It's an endless loop of backward causality. Edwards brilliantly compares it to saying a father is born from his own son. The prevailing of the motive is supposed to be the fruit or result of the choice, but the choice is supposed to be the fruit of the motive.
The motive causes the choice, but the choice causes the motive to be the cause. It is intellectually dizzying because it fundamentally breaks the linear flow of time and causality.
Edwards also mocks Chubb's attempt to sanitize motives by calling them the passive grounds of action.
How can a ground of action be passive?
It can't. Edwards asks how something entirely passive can be the cause of an excitation or an action. It's like arguing that a stationary pane of glass is the passive ground of a rock flying through it without anyone ever throwing the rock.
If a motive is purely passive, it possesses no power. And if it possesses no power, it cannot excite the will to act.
And what about Chubb's bizarre claim that the will can demonstrate its supreme freedom by choosing to follow a weaker motive in direct opposition to a stronger one?
Edwards dismantles this by forcing us to define our terms. What do stronger and weaker actually mean when discussing motives? The strength of a motive is simply its degree of tendency to move the will. That's how we measure it.
So if the will supposedly follows a weaker motive over a stronger one, what is physically or psychologically occurring? It means the will is moving in direct opposition to the greatest weight of perceived evidence, desire, or agreeableness.
Which means the will is generating its own kinetic energy out of an absolute void. If a scale has 50 pounds of weight on the left side and 2 pounds on the right, and the scale tips to the right, the scale isn't demonstrating freedom. The scale is fundamentally broken, or magic is happening.
That is a perfect analogy. If the will can follow the weaker motive against the stronger, it is acting entirely without sufficient reason, or in direct defiance of reason. The choice is fundamentally uncaused by the prevailing reality of the mind.
And we are plunged right back into the absurdity of the uncaused event. Edwards relentlessly drives home the point that volition never happens without a cause, and that cause is invariably and necessarily connected to the strongest motive as perceived by the understanding in that fleeting moment.
So up to this point, Edwards has systematically demolished self-determination, perfect indifference, and contingence using the strict laws of causality and logic. But in the final sections of Part 2, he brings out what is arguably the most cosmic and historically devastating argument against the Arminian position.
Yes, this is where theology and logic collide in a way that creates an insurmountable problem for his opponents. He addresses the profound incompatibility between contingence, the core Arminian idea that human choices happen without any absolute necessity, and the doctrine of God's absolute foreknowledge.
And what makes Edwards' strategy so lethal here is his restraint. He does not rely on his own Calvinist theology to prove that God has foreknowledge. He doesn't quote scripture to browbeat them.
He simply looks at the Arminian writers and says, almost all of you, with the exception of a few radical outliers, already openly admit and confess that God possesses certain infallible foreknowledge of the future.
It was a standard orthodox pillar of 18th century Christian belief across almost all denominations.
He takes their own shared premise and constructs an airtight proof that traps them. Let's walk through the philosophical weight of his argument carefully, because the implications are staggering.
First, we accept the shared premise. God possesses certain infallible foreknowledge of all future events. This includes every single voluntary act, choice, and whim of moral agents.
God knows exactly what you will choose to do 10 years from now, and his knowledge is entirely free from error.
Premise accepted. If God is omniscient, his knowledge of tomorrow is as perfect as his knowledge of yesterday.
Precisely. Now, if God foreknows a future event perfectly and infallibly, then it is mathematically and logically impossible for that event not to happen exactly as it was foreknown.
If God infallibly knows you will choose the cheeseburger on Tuesday, it is impossible for you to choose the salad.
If you were to choose the salad, God's prior knowledge would have been proven false. But we already established in the premise that his knowledge is infallible.
I feel the walls closing in on contingence here. If the knowledge is a fixed certainty, the event must be a fixed certainty.
Therefore, Edwards argues, the future event has a necessary, infallible, and unbreakable connection to the present reality of God's foreknowledge. The future act is indissolubly linked to the past knowledge. They are locked together in the architecture of reality.
Now let's contrast that with the Arminian definition of contingence. By their own strict definition, contingence means an event has absolutely no fixed necessary connection to anything prior to itself.
It is utterly free from all necessity. It could happen or it could equally not happen, depending entirely on the sovereign whim of the will in that exact moment.
And there is the fatal collision. Infallible foreknowledge and Arminian contingence cannot exist in the same universe. If an event is perfectly, infallibly known beforehand, its occurrence is necessary. It must happen.
If its occurrence is necessary, it is not contingent. If it is not contingent, then the Arminian definition of liberty simply does not exist.
It is a devastating sequence of logic. But I have to push back, because I have heard the counter-argument to this, and it's a defense Edwards explicitly addresses in the text. Writers like Whitby and Clark try to escape this trap by flipping the causal relationship.
They say, hold on, God's foreknowledge doesn't cause the human to make the choice. The human's free choice causes God's foreknowledge.
The time traveler defense. They argue God essentially looks down the infinite corridor of time, observes the entirely free, contingent choice you're going to make in the future, and passively possesses knowledge of it in the past.
Therefore, they argue, the event remains free and contingent because God's mere knowledge of it didn't force it to happen.
But Edwards anticipates this defense, and his rebuttal exposes a subtle but massive misunderstanding of his argument.
Edwards responds by clarifying that his argument has absolutely nothing to do with causality. He isn't claiming God's knowledge forces you to act. His argument is entirely about connection.
Explain the difference, because that is a profound distinction.
Edwards says it does not matter in the slightest which way the causal arrow points. It doesn't matter if the future event caused the past knowledge, or the past knowledge caused the future event. What fundamentally matters is the indissoluble link between the two realities.
If event A, your future choice, is perfectly and infallibly linked to reality B, God's past knowledge, and reality B is a fixed, unchangeable fact in the past,
then event A must also be a fixed, unchangeable fact in the future. It cannot be otherwise.
I see it now. If God possessed the knowledge in the year 1000 that you would buy a red car in the year 2000, the knowledge existed for a millennium before you were born. When the year 2000 arrives, you possess absolutely no ability to make God's past knowledge false.
The necessity of your choice is established by the infallible connection to a fixed past, regardless of the mechanism of how God acquired that knowledge.
Edwards writes that to claim an event is perfectly foreknown and yet remains perfectly contingent is a blatant contradiction in terms. It is to say an event is absolutely certain to happen, and yet it is not certain to happen.
You cannot escape the crushing weight of necessity by simply reversing the causal arrow. Therefore, Arminian liberty, which demands a universe with zero necessity, is totally eradicated by the mere existence of God's perfect foreknowledge.
And Edwards points out the theological wreckage that occurs if you try to deny this logic. Let's say a hardcore defender of contingence gets backed into a corner by this argument and says, fine, to save human free will, I will claim that God does not perfectly foreknow the future choices of moral agents. What happens to their worldview then?
It completely collapses. Edwards paints a picture of what a universe governed by a God without foreknowledge would actually look like. It would be a universe where the creator is constantly surprised.
If God does not know what humans will contingently choose to do tomorrow, his entire governance of reality is based on blind guesswork and probabilities.
He wouldn't be a sovereign deity. He would be a deeply stressed out middle manager, constantly putting out fires, reacting to human unpredictability, changing his plans on the fly, and repenting of past actions because he didn't foresee the consequences.
A reactionary God, which, Edwards points out, contradicts all the biblical prophecies, the eternal promises, and the fundamental nature of an omniscient, omnipotent deity that these writers themselves claim to revere.
Edwards is essentially issuing an ultimatum. You can keep your specific contingent definition of free will, or you can keep God's omniscience. You cannot logically or mathematically possess both.
So, looking back at our journey through Part 2, Edwards has systematically walked us through the infinite regress of self-determination.
He has exposed the psychological illusion of pure indifference.
He has demonstrated the absolute necessity of motives and the understanding.
And he has dropped the crushing weight of infallible foreknowledge onto the idea of contingence.
He has taken a sledgehammer to every single pillar of Arminian liberty.
He leaves the entire philosophical structure in ruins.
Which brings us to the ultimate question: what does this all mean for us? We started this exploration by talking about how deeply comforting it is to feel like we have this sovereign, uncaused free will.
If Edwards is right, and that specific type of absolute freedom is nothing but a logical illusion, a trick of our limited perspective, are we just meat robots? Is everything just a bleak, deterministic machine?
Not at all. And this is the profound shift in perspective Edwards offers. He is arguing that the ultimate freedom you think you value, a random, uncaused, indifferent sovereignty over yourself, isn't actually what you want.
Think about it. If your choices were truly uncaused by your motives, your character, your loves, or your understanding of what is good, you wouldn't be free. You would be experiencing sheer madness.
Edwards uses this haunting phrase in the text. He says if we acted without motive or cause, we would be like smoke that is driven by the wind.
Exactly. If you saw someone you deeply loved in grave danger and your mind was in a state of perfect indifference and your ultimate choice to save them was completely uncaused by your love for them or your perception of their value, is that a commendable moral act?
No, it's just a random spasm of the universe that happened to look like a rescue.
So the true nature of choice, according to the framework Edwards is building, is that every single choice you make is necessarily, inevitably connected to your understanding, your motives, your history, and the broader chain of reality. Your choices are the necessary effects of exactly who you are and what you perceive in any given moment.
But, and this is the crucial redeeming distinction, that you are still the one acting. You are not a machine. A machine is a physical object guided entirely by the understanding and motives of its maker. A clock ticks because a clockmaker arranged the gears to do so. The clock perceives nothing.
But your will is guided by your own understanding. You do what you please. You choose exactly what you perceive as the greatest good in that moment. Edwards argues that being able to act according to your own desires and understanding is the only coherent, logical definition of freedom that can possibly exist.
You are free to do what you want, but you cannot independently choose what you want. Your wants are determined by your nature, your experiences, and your perception of the world. It's like the X-ray machine of human choice isn't broken. It's just showing us a vastly more complex, interconnected circulatory system of motives, causes, and desires, rather than a solid, impenetrable bone of uncaused sovereignty.
The diagnostic muddy waters clear up beautifully when you finally accept that the water is the mechanism. The flow of motives is the very substance of your agency.
I want to leave the listener with a final provocative thought to mull over, drawn directly from the text, but expanding outward into how we view the universe. Edwards points out something utterly fascinating about the nature of God himself.
The text argues that God's own will is entirely perfectly necessary. Because God is, by definition, perfectly wise and perfectly good, he cannot choose to do anything other than what is supremely wise and perfect. He is absolutely bound by the moral necessity of his own perfect nature.
Yes. The theological consensus is that God cannot choose to act arbitrarily or commit evil. He is morally necessitated to do only the greatest good.
Yet, across centuries of theology and philosophy, almost everyone considers God to be the most perfectly free being in existence.
So here is the profound contradiction Edwards forces us to confront. If the ultimate being's will is entirely bound by the necessity of his own perfection, why do we humans arrogantly insist that our freedom requires the ability to randomly choose otherwise?
What if true freedom isn't the chaotic ability to act without a cause? What if true freedom, in its highest and purest form, is the ability to act necessarily and inevitably in accordance with the greatest good?
It completely inverts the paradigm. We are conditioned to think that necessity is the mortal enemy of freedom. Edwards suggests that perfect necessity toward the good is the absolute highest form of freedom a being can possess.
It makes you rethink the architecture of every single choice you made today. Were you acting as an uncaused, isolated sovereign? Or were you just beautifully, inevitably, and necessarily following the greatest motive your mind could perceive in that exact moment?
It is something to deeply consider the next time you find yourself standing in front of a menu, tracing the origins of your desire, and choosing between the burger and the salad.